profit gross earnings. So we are very, very pleased to welcome Joe Aldous, Jason Reeves, and Andrew Schutte again. So hopefully several of you would have been to the first session that we're running, and we've got another one, I believe, on the 17th of September. So I will hand over to them to kick off. Also worth mentioning, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I think we're going to try and come to them at the end, but we'll be monitoring them throughout. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for everyone joining us today. This is a topic that's near and dear to our heart. This follows on from our last session, which was given in person back in May. And, it was 21st of May, and that was the anatomy of BI, which is a nice little intro to the constituent parts of business interruption. And today we're going to talk about gross profit versus gross earnings, or UK versus US business interruption approaches. So today's agenda specifically is we're going to look at the similarities and differences between gross earnings and gross profit forms. We're going to look at the period of restoration. We're going to look at the indemnity period. We're going to do some maths. Hooray! Which is going to be a lot of fun. And mostly at the end of this, what we want you to have is we want you to have an almost elevator pitch understanding as to the key differences between gross earnings and gross profit. They have very different feel and very different shape. We're going to take you through that. We're going to take you through the technical stuff, and then we're going to take you through the stuff that's very similar and the stuff that you need to pay attention to. Now, some of you may remember, if you attended last session, that the approach that we have with gross profit forms reflects its origin in 19th century economies, mainly in Europe, and that's in contrast to the gross earnings forms. And if we think about these two different approaches, we can think about it as, in Europe, certainly in the 19th century, the economies were very rigid, and there was lots of competition, and it was oversubscribed, and there weren't that many customers. And so there was intense competition. And so ensuring what you needed on the business income side when you had a loss was a very specific thing. And you needed to ensure the sales. And the American approach is, you know what, just let me rebuild and I'll find the customers. And so this very sort of, basic approach to how the business interruption forms have taken off. It does have roots in sort of a cultural or sort of a heritage, historical approach as to how economies get treated, whether it's a sophisticated, tight market or whether there is seen as unlimited opportunity. The reality in today's world is that it's far more complicated than that, and that's why we have Joe here. So Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm the accountant in the group. You work that out because when I talk, you'll feel a bit sleepy. And then when Jason and Andrew speak, you'll feel more invigorated. So the objective with business interruption is indemnity. We're trying to put the insured back into the same position that they would have been but for the incident, but it's subject to policy wording. And so it's that sort of policy wording that we're going to look at today and some of the differences. In the UK, the forms we generally see are gross revenue and gross profit. In the US, the forms that are commonly seen are gross earnings and business income. What we're focusing on today is gross profit versus gross earnings, because they've got the most differences. And increasingly, we're seeing policies where you have the choice to opt between a gross profit wording or a gross earnings wording. So we're going to try and highlight some of the key differences there, so you can see what the words mean and some of the impacts on loss calculations. I think those of you who came to our first session will know this. I'm just going to very, very briefly run over what we mean by gross profit. Those of you who can remember, this blue box is meant to represent revenue. Businesses earn the revenue. They then incur costs, and they generally group them into cost of sales and overheads. And hopefully there's a bit of revenue left over that becomes the net profit. From an accounting perspective, gross profit is the bottom part. It's net profit plus overheads or total sales revenue less cost of sales. And those of you can remember is when we talk about gross profit from an insurance perspective, do we mean this? No, of course not. That would be madness. We talk about something completely different. We actually look to allocate the costs between variable costs. Those are costs which vary in proportion to sales revenue and would be saved following an incident, and fixed costs, those costs which should not be affected by sales revenue, although they may be to some extent. So when we talk about gross profit from a business interruption perspective, it's sales revenue less variable costs or net profit plus fixed costs. To illustrate that very briefly, those of you working from home at the moment, this is a glass of beer. For those of you working in the office, this is a glass of alcohol-free beer. And we use this to illustrate the difference between fixed and variable costs. The liquid beer is likely to behave as a variable cost. The more beer you sell, the more beer that has to be bought in. The less beer that's sold, the less beer that has to be bought in. So the cost of the beer is varying in direct proportion to revenue, whereas the glass normally operates as a fixed cost. The more beer you sell, you just need to wash up the glass regularly, and the less beer you sell, well, you leave the glass on the shelf. The other key thing with fixed and variable costs is to take account of time. Over a few seconds, all costs are fixed. Over 100 years, all costs are variable, because if you're not selling enough beer, the pub will close. The periods that we're looking at is interruption periods and sort of the maximum indemnity periods. Those are the periods we look at to work out whether we think a cost is going to behave in a variable way or a fixed way. Those who like graphs, which I do, this is what it looks like on a graph. It's basically showing that the beer cost will go up in proportion to the number of units sold, whereas the cost of the glass remains the same. So very quickly, UK forms, gross profits and gross revenue. The difference really is if you have a business that has variable costs, so a mercantile business where you're buying in products to sell, or you're a manufacturing business where you have large raw material costs, then gross profit wording fits the business because those variable costs will be saved or should be saved following a reduction in revenue. If you have a business that doesn't really have variable costs, like an accounting practice, a law practice, where all your costs really are fixed, then a gross revenue wording may be more suitable. People like gross profit because the amount you're insuring is smaller and normally the premium is lower. US forms, very briefly. So to contrast the wordings and the words used, on the UK gross profit form, so we split the costs between variable costs and fixed costs. The terminology in gross earnings wording and often in US forms, it talks about non-continuing costs and continuing costs. I think those are easier to understand. A non-continuing cost is a cost that won't continue if there's a loss of revenue, and a continuing cost is a cost that will continue if there's a loss of revenue. The key difference between the two is often the variable costs in a gross profit wording are defined, and it normally picks up costs which are entirely 100% variable, but you may still get other savings in fixed costs, which is why you need a savings clause in a UK gross profit form. US forms, typically gross earnings, it'll be on an output or production basis, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. And it often is worded in this sort of top-down approach, sales less non-continuing costs. Business income forms tend to be on a sales basis, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And it tends to be written on a net profit plus continuing costs. But this top-down, bottom-up, sales less non-continuing or net profit plus continuing, you get to the same answer. So let's compare and contrast them. That's the king playing a carrot, which what else could you wish for? And then the king of rock and roll playing a guitar. So they told me to put a joke in it. I thought I'd just do that, get it over and done with early. So the similarities between gross profit and gross earnings, these have different words, but actually you get to the same place. The wording we use in the UK generally is business interruption, that loss of profit, loss of income type cover. In gross earnings wording, it's referred to as time element. That's relevant because normally the loss of profit will be determined by the length of time of the loss. In gross profit wordings, you will have a loss of gross profit you have to calculate, but you need to have a savings clause because there may be savings in the fixed costs. In gross earnings wording, it sort of has this actual loss sustained type wording, which allows you to get to the same answer, but you can go in one step rather than gross profit, where you go 2 steps. First the gross profit, then calculate the savings. Increased costs of working in a gross profit wording, these are costs which are being incurred to mitigate or reduce the loss of gross profit. There is an economic test for that. In gross earnings wording, it's known as the expense to reduce loss. Does the same thing, a cost that's being incurred to reduce or mitigate the loss of profit. In gross profit wordings, there is then something called an additional increased cost of working. These are like increased cost of working, so they're costs that are being incurred to reduce or mitigate the loss of gross profit. They do not have to be economic. That's why there is or should be a limit on additional increased cost of working, because you can, if you could justify it, buy yourself a Ferrari if that would save a few pounds of revenue. But you'd have to prove that's the case. In the gross earnings wording, the equivalent is extra expense. So those broadly mean the same thing. But the caveat I always give, although I'm not a lawyer, is it will depend how these are defined and the wordings that are used. And so you can get some very different answers depending on how they've been defined. But if they're defined in the normal way, they should be broadly similar. The best bit of the policy, because that's why you need a forensic accountant, is with gross profit, there's normally in other circumstances or trends clause. This is the clause that says you can ignore what happened last year and work out what the business would have done had the incident not occurred. In gross earnings wording, it has this actual loss sustained wording. So you're trying to calculate the actual loss sustained by the business. So those are the key bits that allow it to, it allows the policy to provide for what the business would have done absent the incident. Now, sorry, those of you who like films about forensic accountants, The Accountant 2 is out. I very often have that same look on my face, but not normally with guns. It's normally when I'm poking my head around the corner to see if there's a key for the coffee machine. But you can forget everything I say today, but the next slide is the most important one that I talk about. There are 2 key differences that can give you a very different answer from an accounting perspective between gross profit and gross earnings. The first one is the period of time that you're basing calculations on. Gross profit has a maximum indemnity period. It defines how long you look at to calculate the losses of a business, whereas gross earnings has something called a period of restoration. And Jason's going to talk about that in a bit more detail, but it's linked to the period to do the repairs rather than the defined period. The second most important thing, or the second biggest issue and difference, is gross profit wordings are based on sales. So you're calculating the loss of sales for the business. And so if a big customer is lost and your losses exceed your loss of production because you've lost a huge customer, that would normally get picked up under a gross profit wording. Whereas gross earnings wording are based on loss of output or production. It is still the loss of sales arising from the loss of output and loss of production, but that loss of output gives you a cap. So you will only get the losses up to the point at which the loss of production has occurred. Right, now I hand over to Jason.
So we're going to start with some grammar, because grammar is always fun. Joe spoke about this period of restoration, and really it is the theoretical period of restoration that we're looking at here. But in order to really get there, let's just go through a few things. I think grammar is not often in the news, but it frequently is for law. And people like Andrew and me, and undoubtedly a number of you on the phone, will enjoy that, because grammar is a lot of fun. And this is a case that actually came in before the lockdown, but it's really interesting. It's a $10 million grammar question. If you get it right, well, you win nothing today, but you would have won $10 million here. So this is the grammar in the news part of the session. And does anybody see what the issue is? Well, it's an Oxford comma issue. Should there be a comma there, or should there not be a comma there? And, the question, does the law intend to exempt the distribution of the three categories that follow, or does it mean to exempt packing for the shipping or distribution of them? It's an interesting question, and resolved in the First Circuit, so that was fun. The Oxford comma is always interesting, and oftentimes when we get to the words, as Joe said, he might not construe the policy, but he sees these things quite a bit, and on the decision-making side of things, see things quite a bit. And this is one of those things. So I'd like for you to all read this. This is a typical period of restoration language from a typical gross earnings clause. I would like for you all to read this. And because we're not in a room together, I can't call on any of you, but I would like for you to think about what the most important word that is in this paragraph is. Well, it is would. That is the most important. I'm not sure it's showing up on your screens as well as I would like it to. But the most important, it's showing up on that screen. Great, perfect. So would is the most important word in the period of restoration language. So when we say period of restoration, you want to check the period of restoration definition and make sure that it does have this, because this is the subjunctive tense. And the subjunctive is essentially a hypothetical tense rather than the indicative, which is essentially a statement of fact. And the difference between this is that one injects this idea of a theoretical period of restoration. It's how long something would be required rather than how long is required. And those things are very, very different. Now, there are a couple of cases that I think are really key to understanding this, and both of them arise out of the 9/11 litigation from a while ago. And this one's the Duane Reade case and St. Paul, and it actually is then cited in the Swiss Re case, which is actually an old Zelle case, and it's all from the Southern District of New York. And, here we have a question about how the period of restoration should be treated. Because the policyholder here was arguing that we should have how long it should take or how long it does take rather than how long it should take. And of course, rebuilding the Twin Towers was going to take, a long time. It was going to take more than 10 years. So the question as to how long it should take versus how long it will take is a very different thing to look at. So here, the policyholder cited some Roe v. case law, and the case law cited by insurers was a little more on point because it actually spoke to the actual issues in place. I think having the precedents out there is really important. I'm just going to load the next part. Here we go. And so this is what the judge actually ended up saying. The restoration period clause envisioned hypothetical or constructive as opposed to an actual time frame or rebuilding. And I think when you start looking at this and you think, well, how long does it take to rebuild the pharmacy in the basement of the Twin Towers? Well, is that going to be a 10-year process? Should it be a 10-year process? What if they don't rebuild? These are all questions that really come up. And this idea of how long something should take really shapes most U.S. business interruption disputes. Period of restoration, it begins at the date of loss. The period of restoration ends when the property is rebuilt, repaired, or replaced. it does not end at the date of the expiration of the policy. So that can be really, really confusing to people. Because if you have a gross profit wording, the maximum indemnity period is, for example, 2 years. And so if you've not rebuilt by the end of those 2 years, then you're out of luck. You don't get paid any more business interruption. However, in the United States, it is when the property is rebuilt, repaired, or replaced. That's what the period of restoration is. Now, the period of restoration disputes always concern this actual versus theoretical approach to resolving this. And of course, we expect the policyholder to exercise due diligence. We expect them to get out there and commence the rebuild. And to be fair, a number of these things are things that Andrew is going to tell you we require with gross profit under English forms as well. There's just a little more sting in the tail with this because in the UK with gross profit forms, if you don't do these things, there's still a cap, which is the maximum indemnity period. Whereas in the US, it just kind of runs and runs and runs until the end. So all kinds of questions arise. What if they're not going to rebuild? What if they're not going to rebuild the same thing? What if they're delayed? What if they're going to make significant improvements to the property? What if there's indecision on what they're going to rebuild? What if there's strikes? So could there be difficulties negotiating the lease? Incidentally, for the 9/11 issues, renegotiating the leases, which were renegotiated every 10 years, was seen as the ultimate period of restoration. No business interruption claim could have gone beyond that because of that sort of firm deadline, because they had to find one that was going to work. So the period of restoration disputes, does it go until the operations are restored to the previous level? Typically, no. And does it concern the entire business or the single location? And that was really what the Duane Reade case that I mentioned earlier was about. Well, what if they were to shift all of their sales to the other lower Manhattan Duane Reade pharmacy locations? I think then that would probably be illusory coverage. And here we've got the theoretical period of restoration, which is the period of restoration, but it's the theoretical, it is the subjunctive. It's how long it should take, how long it would take, not how long it does take. So in fact, that allows you to set the theoretical period of restoration in advance. So this is what most business interruption disputes look like. We get a loss, we get an explosion. You can see where the explosion was here because that's where the firemen are spraying water. And of course, when we're responsible as insurers for paying for the damaged part of that to rebuild the physical damage of the loss that's covered under the policy. Absolutely, all day long, that's what we're going to do. And we're going to pay the business interruption loss associated with it. But what typically happens in these kinds of loss scenarios is, well, we start looking at the rest of the plant and we see that, wait a minute, what's going on over here in this part of the plant? We, in fact, have corrosion under insulation, or we have some other issue that's unrelated to the actual subject claim, but it nevertheless impacts the timeline of the repairs. So when we have a theoretical period of restoration and we have other damage that's being repaired that isn't covered by the policy in question, or we have a significant upgrade, how do we treat that? Policyholders always seem to arrive at a date where all of those things have no impact on the repair of the damaged area, and that all of the dates work to resolve it along the damaged property timeline. And of course, we end up hiring scheduling companies and looking at how many man hours these things should take. And all of this is really unsatisfactory because it's ultimately us and our experts and vendors explaining to a court, a jury, the risk manager, the brokers, why our independent off-site evaluation of how many man hours is required to repair something that isn't associated with the damage is impacting the timeline of the damage repairs. And we're left to, run that argument against policyholders and risk managers who actually know what their plant is and actually know how it works. So that's very difficult. So it looks like this where we find damage, or perhaps there's just going to be a brand new rebuild to the whole plant. And this scheduling, this timeline crush, this pressure on getting things done and having the adjustment team usually have some scheduling concerns as part of it, it impacts every business interruption claim in the United States that I've ever worked on, it's got a real certain feel about it. But a lot of the other things that exist out there are things that Andrew is going to talk about in a context related to gross profit, where we see them more commonly. And so, Andrew, I think we are going to run these slides for you, right?
You've got that right. It's
Okay.
going to be like a COVID flashback where I go, next slide, please.
There we go.
Awesome. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the gross profit form, and we're going to look at how the mechanics of the wording fit together. And that's going to mean spending most of my part of this session looking at the maximum indemnity period, which is really the key concept alongside the fact that we are ensuring results, but it's all tied up. So stick with me, and we will deal with both, but we're gonna focus in to start with on the indemnity period. So this is the key concept when we're looking at gross profit forms. So here, time is going to run out. We've got this drop dead date after which there is no cover for business interruption. So the indemnity period, very important. How does the wording define indemnity period? Well, you see on the screen an example. So what it's saying here is the period beginning with the occurrence of the incident, that would be the trigger for business interruption, and ending not later than the maximum indemnity period. That's in capitals, and invariably that will be defined, and it'll be 6 months or a year or 3 years or whatever it may be. Not later than the maximum indemnity period thereafter, during which the results of the business shall be affected in consequence thereof. You might have slightly more modern language than that, but then again, you might not. So we're looking at the results of the business that shall be affected in consequence thereof. Hold on, Tiger. I've still got to talk to this previous slide for another couple of minutes. Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, so what we're looking at is the period from the date of the loss, okay, subject to any waiting period or time retention, until the date when the results of the business stop being affected. So in contrast to the US form, we're not interested in how long it may, would, or actually does take to repair the damage. That's not the measure for the period of indemnity. We might be interested in it from a quantum perspective, but we're not interested in it from a coverage perspective. It's not how long it's going to take to repair, or should take to repair. And it's not when the business is back up and running. That's actually not what we're looking for either. What we're looking for is when the results of the business stop being affected. So that's effectively when we get to the business back to the results that it would have had if no trigger incident had occurred. So you might be thinking, what do we mean by results? And that would be an excellent question, because results is quite a wide term. So it's going to include the business's income, its turnover or sales, to use the various terms that Joe used earlier. So how much money is coming in. It also encompasses the costs of the business. So how much is going out. Now, results of a business could actually go up after an incident instead of going down, and we'll come and look at that later. But it's that word results. We want the results to get back on an even keel after the incident, and that will be the end of our indemnity period, subject to this cutoff at the end of the maximum indemnity period. So what that means is, on the one hand, the UK form, the gross profit form, is more generous than the gross earnings form that Jason was just talking about, because it includes time taken to, for example, win back market share in order to get your income levels up to where they would have been. It would also include the time that it takes to get costs back under control, back on an even keel where they would have been if the incident hadn't occurred. So we might call that a build-up period, for example. But on the other hand, so that's more generous, but on the other hand, it's more stingy than the gross earnings or the US form, because we've got this absolute cap on the indemnity period. It ends not later than the end of the maximum indemnity period. So even if the time that it should have taken to repair the damage, if it's property damage cover, even though that would be the period we'd be looking at under the US form, that's not what we're interested in here. And so the consequence of that is that from a policyholder perspective, selecting the right indemnity period is super important, because the purpose of business interruption is to allow the policyholder to get back on their feet, because the reason this cover exists is just fixing the damage. If it's property cover, that's not going to get the insured back to where they would have been. They need the business interruption. If they don't have enough indemnity period, if the maximum indemnity period is too short, we don't have a product that's fit for purpose. And that could be a problem for the policyholder. It could potentially be a problem for the broker if the broker has not advised on that properly. So to wrap up this slide, get ready to press the trigger, guys. Under the UK form, we've got this ticking clock and we've got this drop dead date, and that is set at the date the risk is written. There's no flex on that. It's a hard number of days or months built into the contract itself. So the insurers really need to think, how long do I need? Next slide. Yeah, you see how the next slide fits in? Kind of thought about this ahead of time. Thank you. So what might take the time? All right, similar stuff to the things that Jason's been talking about when he was looking at the US form. So getting access to the premises. There's been a flood, there's been a fire on a property loss. You need to get in. It needs to be safe to get in and start doing the repairs. You might be able to get to the damaged site. Yes, thank you. Next point. But you need the right repair window. So if it's a flood, you might need to wait for the premises to dry out. And offshore loss, you're going to need good weather. You'll need a weather window to go in there and do the work. You might be undertaking, next click, viability studies. So you might be testing materials. You might be selecting a repair method. You might be going out to tender. You might be doing all sorts of things preparatory to the actual repair work. That can take the time. We've also got the question of lead times. I mean, if you're an office-based business, I mean, I'm not sure what we consume anymore. We're not meant to use paper. Toilet roll, maybe. Law firms go under. We couldn't all go to work if there's no toilet roll. Take a flippant example. But there's no lead time on that. You just go to Tesco's. On the other hand, if we're not a law firm, and in fact we're generating electricity and we need a new turbine, someone might have to build it unless there's one already available in the market. So that would be a scenario where the lead time, the ordering time, would be a very significant thing that might take time, and you'd want to take that into account in setting your MIP. You might also, click again, you might also want to think about the difference between a full and partial repair. Right? It takes a builder longer to fit a new kitchen if you need to keep using the kitchen than if you clear out and let them get on with it. And it's the same if you have a factory that's still trying to produce stuff while you're doing the repairs. It might actually take longer to do a partial repair, and that's not always properly considered. And then the other 2 points we've got on the slide, I think, getting planning permission or sign off from a regulator. And finally, seasonal businesses, it might, especially if you've got less than a year's worth of maximum indemnity period, it could make a lot of difference whether a loss occurs and the outage occurs over your busy time of year. And if that's the case, maybe you should consider getting something that's going to cover you over the correct period. So lots of considerations for policyholders. The thing is, the longer the maximum indemnity period, normally the more expensive the cover. So it's not always a prudent approach that gets taken. But at the claim side, it's definitely the case that if there is insufficient maximum indemnity period, so in other words, the outage lasts longer than the period that's provided for in the policy, then we are all set up to have at least some sort of pushback from the policyholder. Fundamentally, there may be underinsured. And as I've hinted at already, that can be a problem for the broker, but it can also be a difficulty for us because the policyholder is bound to feel unsatisfied. Next slide, please. So we've heard already from Jason about scheduled maintenance and idle periods and making a power generation plant much better than it was before. And under the gross profits form, we don't pick up that stuff any more than we would do under the US form. Like, we do strip that stuff out, but we would maybe ask a slightly different question under gross profit. So what we want to know really is, because we're looking only for the insured's result being affected in consequence of the insured incident, we're looking for the outage that's caused by the business interruption trigger, and we're also looking at how long that outage is. So obviously, if you've got a scheduled maintenance period, or you've got some betterment works, all of the delay that arises from that sort of thing is not affecting it's not the incident affecting the results of the business. Those are things which are unrelated to the BI trigger. So we don't pick them up. And normally, depending on what you've got for an other circumstances or a trends clause, if you've got some but-for type language in there, so that you're saying, well, we're only going to pay for to put you back in the position you would have been but for the incident, we can arrive at the same place from a different route. So those two things ought to be complementary. We're only picking up the outage that arises as a result of the insured incident. If you've then got, next bullet point, please, another incident that causes some sort of outage, then we can have some fun, and you can get a coverage report from us that talks about causation, perhaps in some depth, because a further outage from a covered peril might be triggering a new indemnity period. We might have overlapping indemnity periods, and then we might have to go to Joe and say, Joe, can you allocate loss to incident 1 and incident 2? I mean, if it's a complete outage, you can only be completely out once, so they can't get double bubble. But you might have a scenario where you are able to allocate cost to incident 1 and incident 2. That can be fiddly, that can be quite expensive and time consuming if you have to go down that route. On the other hand, you might find that you've got another thing that's caused outage, which isn't covered at all. And then in a sense, you've got to do a similar exercise, but you're not working out whether there's overlap. You're working out really whether you've got stuff that we can put out all together because it arises from that second cause. And then if you have the delay between physical damage and the effect on the business, this is like a sort of latent damage type scenario. It need not be physical damage. It could just be the trigger, the BI trigger, whatever you have. But if that happens sometime before the interruption, and the interruption happens later, perhaps it happens in a different policy period, then what's going on with that? And we do have quite a lot of English case law on this, so that absent particular contract wordings to the contrary, you are likely going to be looking at the date of the physical damage or other BI trigger as being the date on which the BI is deemed to have occurred. We got that originally from the Loyal, Trend and Creechurch decision. That's quite old now, but there have been a couple more since then. The various eateries case is pretty clear about that. So even if there is a delay, normally on the case law, unless you've got weird words, you're going to be looking at the cover that would have picked up the PD or other trigger, and then it will also pick up the BI, even if the BI happens much later on. Next slide, please. So Jason touched on this. What happens if you just don't repair it? I assume no one's going to repair that thing you can see on the screen. It'd be impressive if they did. I mean, certainly it's the case that the insured may never bounce back. and it could be for all sorts of different reasons. Maybe it's just not practical given the size of the incident or the severity of the incident. The length of the interruption might outstrip the maximum indemnity period. They just can't afford it. They might not have enough cover to do the repairs in the first place. The market might have died for unrelated reasons. The owners might decide to retire anyway. Anything could happen, really. So what happens under the gross profits form if that happens, that sort of scenario? If you could go to the next slide, please, we can see the sort of clause that you might see dealing with this. So here, claims condition, the insured shall with due diligence carry out, permit to be taken any action which may be reasonably practical to minimize or check any interruption or interference with the business, or to avoid or diminish the loss. So this is wording requiring the insured to mitigate their loss. Possibly something which we would be able to argue is there by implication, but much stronger. We feel much more secure if we've got some language like this in here. And we can use this clause if we have it to say to the insured, you can only claim for the period of interruption that you would have had. Jason will appreciate the subjunctive that I'm using there. The period that you would have had if you had not only undertaken expeditious repairs, but you'd taken all reasonable steps to get your business back on track. So we're only going to indemnify you to the extent that you have done everything that you reasonably could do to minimize the loss. Now, we don't rely on this anywhere near as much as you would do under a gross earnings form, because normally the maximum indemnity period will kick in at a certain point and it's no longer going to be relevant. But if you had a scenario where, for example, we knew before the end of the maximum indemnity period, the repairs are not going to be made, the insured's gone into voluntary liquidation, for example, what do? Well, we ask Joe, we do the numbers and we say, well, what would be the best outcome? What's going to diminish the loss? Was it actually the most cost-effective route to put the company under, or would it actually have been more cost-effective? Would you have made less loss if you'd stayed trading? And then we base our coverage assessment on that calculation. And then finally, you don't need the red. Talk to this already. I want the kids.
Oh, kids. Okay, hang on.
Until you see children on the screen, we are.
You've done this bit.
There.
Stop.
There, children on the screen. All right. So this is makeup. I said I'd talk about this at the beginning of my slot, and so I will. So makeup, not scary. Actually, that kid in the middle is quite scary. Looks a bit like my daughter. Similar vibe, similar energy. Anyway, makeup shouldn't be scary. All it means is sometimes you might find that a policyholder earns more than usual during the indemnity period. So, for example, they may have a load of backed up orders, they get back up and running after 6 months, and then it's boom time. In that scenario, under the English form, the gross profits form, we can credit the makeup of losses against the loss, and we do it over the indemnity period. So if they had an uptick, for example, through backed up orders, we would be able to apply some makeup. We get the benefit of some of the upside. But importantly, whether it's bad things, loss, or good things, makeup, under the gross profit form, it all comes to an end at the end of the maximum indemnity period. And I'm going to leave you with that thought as I hand you back to Joe for some late afternoon maths.
Yes, I'll be very quick. That's it's another joke, 2 jokes. It's like being on a comedy show. Right. I'm just going to give a very basic example, trying to illustrate this with some numbers, which is what I find easy to understand the concepts. There is only 2 facts. We have a business that's burned down. The reinstatement period to do the repairs is 18 months, and we have a gross profit wording with a maximum indemnity period of 12 months. If we first look at the gross earnings form, we're looking at the expected revenue over the 18-month period of $300. It's a very high turnover business. It's about $100 every 6 months. We've split the cost between non-continuing costs, which will stop if there's a loss of revenue, and continuing costs that will continue if there's a loss of revenue. So we're expecting the business to make a net profit of $75. What I'm going to do going forward is I'm just going to read out the sales revenue line, the top line, and the net profit line, the bottom line, because those are the two key pieces of information. So what we're expecting this business to do: sales revenue 300, net profit of 75. What happens is they've had a fire, so there's no sales revenue, non-continuing costs stop, so it makes a net loss of $105. The business interruption, or time element loss, if you'd like to refer to it that way, is a loss of revenue of $300, but we've got some saved costs in the non-continuing costs, so the total BI loss of $180. If insurers pay the policyholder $180, they're put back into the same position. So that's what you get with the gross earnings form. The gross profit form, well, we've only got a 12-month maximum indemnity period, so we can only look at the expected performance over 12 months. And over 12 months, we're expecting sales revenue of $200 and a net profit of $50. What happened during that 12-month period? There was no revenue. We've got some saved variable costs, and it made a net loss of $70. So the BI loss is a loss of revenue of $200 and a net BI loss after cost savings of $120. If insurers pay the policyholder $120, it put them back into the same position they would have been for the 12-month period. So we look at that as a summary. The actual loss suffered by the business is $180. The gross earnings wording, because it's looking at the theoretical period of restoration, will pay $180, but the gross profit wording will only pay $120. So in that respect, you really want to have the gross earnings wording in order to be fully indemnified. I'm going to make one change to the facts. Instead of the gross profit form having a maximum indemnity period of 12 months, we're going to actually give them 24 months. So with 24 months, we can then look at the losses over the full 18 months that the business was repaired. And so you will now actually get exactly the same answer with a gross earnings and gross profit. It's like a match made in heaven. I'm now going to make one more change to the facts. And this is where we actually lost a key customer because they were fed up with waiting for their product to be provided or sent to them by the affected business. You've lost them, and those sales are lost. Sales were adversely affected for this business for 6 months before they could find an alternative customer to replace them. So from a gross earnings, it's looking at the losses in the 18-month period. There is no difference. You only get $180. But with the gross profit form, well, we're looking at the 24-month maximum indemnity period. So over that period, we have expected sales revenue of $400 and a net profit of $100. What actually happened was over the 24 months is there was no revenue for the first 18 months. But when the 6 months that it opened, it made about half what it normally makes. So it made a net loss of $110. BI loss is the difference between the two. So here, if you pay the policyholder $210, they're put back into the same position over 24 months. So in summary, we have an actual loss suffered by the business of $210. The gross earnings form is going to pay them $180, but the gross profit form will pay them $210. So now you're better off having a gross profit form. It's extremely difficult to find British sports people who have won stuff. It was my big takeaway for trying to find this particular photo, but she is a very talented equestrian star, whose name I can't remember, but that's just my ignorance. Okay, I'm going to make one more change to the fact pattern. So instead of a key customer being lost as a result of this incident, we have very, very loyal customers, and they've been waiting for the insured to get back into business. So actually, we have some makeup in those 6 months after the business reopens. Gross earnings form is over the 18-month period. There's no change, $180. The gross profit form, though, it can look at the full 24 months. And what actually happened was in the 6 months it was opened, it overperformed. It made $150 in that period. So its net loss was only $50. So the BI loss is $150, and they are put back in the same position over the 24-month period. So here we have a situation where the actual loss of the business is $150. Gross earnings will pay out $180, and the gross profit form will pay $150. So now the policyholder is better off having the gross earnings wording. In fact, they're getting over indemnified. Now, do they often and normally get over indemnified? Well, no, because there's often extra bits of language in the policy, particularly the gross earnings wordings. Sometimes there's little comment about looking at reasonable make-up periods after the period of restoration, which would then pick up those customers who've been waiting and that pent-up demand. Also, you may get extended periods of indemnity. Gross profit have these other clauses that go in, savings clauses, to try and narrow the differences between gross earnings and gross profit. There are also some other ones. The only one I'm going to mention there is wages and payroll. It is normal in the US for production staff to be let go or furloughed following an incident. That is not the case normally in Europe. So the expectation with US declarations are they're going to assume that production payroll costs are a saving, whereas in reality, they probably aren't because they're skilled labour and they won't be in the UK. But that's it. People who want more maths, you can phone me and I'll happily go through it slower.
So if we go back to the very beginning and we think, the UK and Europe, they get concerned because after they had a loss, they're less concerned about losing customers than they are about losing profit. And in the US, they're concerned that they won't be able to produce, so they won't have customers. And so, if you take those two starting points, that's a sort of very crude way to understand how business interruption differences arise. And then all the little bits and pieces that we've talked about. And really, we've just scratched the surface. As both Andrew and Joe mentioned, there's a lot of additional points that sort of smooths out some of the discrepancies between these two policies. What we see and we're most concerned with, the three of us, Andrew, Joe, and I, is when there's a merger of these two approaches and people pick and choose words from a gross profit form and from a gross earnings form and mix it up and match it because they like the way a particular phrase sounds or rings in the ear. And that's really dangerous. The other issue, of course, is that, despite most of you either working largely in one system or the other system with different BI approaches, what we increasingly see is a number of policies are issued now where the policyholder gets to elect whether it's going to pursue a gross profit or a gross earnings claim after the loss has occurred. So that injects another level of complexity. The policyholder is entitled in that circumstance to choose the best outcome for them. And you, as conversant claims folks and underwriters and brokers, need to understand what those differences are so that you can advise people appropriately. So this is really just the intro to this session and to all the issues that we end up dealing with in a real claim. But hopefully you've got the elevator pitch and you've got the most important slide that Joe went through earlier, and then you've got the series of examples, and you'll get all this on a PDF soon. What I will say before we go and look at questions is that, look, the three of us really like talking about this. If what we've gone through today or in the other BI sessions that we've done is something that you want us to come deliver in-house for your team, we're happy to do that. So just let us know and we can make sure that that gets arranged. So what we're going to do now is we are going to stop sharing our screen and we are going to take any questions that may have come in during the session.
I've got two up right here. So Campbell HE says, if you've got gross earnings or gross profit as an option, often the language between the two types of measurements gets blended. Can you speak to any of the most common errors you see of gross earnings language creeping into gross profit or vice versa, which is what you were just saying, Jason? I don't know whether there's like a most common version, but this is super common.
Yeah. I see the words actual
we often
loss
find
sustained.
I see it probably more in cyber than anything else.
Yeah. I see the words
actual
actual
people
loss,
love that.
actual, yeah. actual loss sustained, people love that. They love to put it into a gross profit form. And of course, it has no meaning in a gross profit form. The actual loss sustained is what allows the policy wording and allows Joe to do his magic, just like the circumstances or the trends clause does in the gross profit wording. But people really like the words actual loss sustained. And, I have a claim, which I mentioned to you earlier, Andrew and Joe, that, somebody liberally added some words in thinking that they were adding some value to the policy, and they only complicated it significantly as a result of that. So before you start mixing and matching your words, make sure that you're in the right lane for what that is. That'd be the most common one, Campbell-H.
Yeah. So next one, although having MIP cutting off cover, presumably the US version still needs to have an adequate sum insured to cover the theoretical period of restoration, so the sum insured could still run out before you get the thing rebuilt. That's one for you, Jason, I guess.
Yeah, look, I think another one of our sessions, Andrew has a big part where he talks about the vast level of underinsurance that we see in the market. We see that particularly when it comes to business interruption. People are comfortable talking about corrosion and explosions, less comfortable talking about numbers, even though that's where the real money is. The period of restoration might not have much reality when you get to the actual limits of the financial limits set out for the policy. Because there's going to be a cap on the money side for sure. And that's always a limit, but there's no real remedy under most US laws for underinsurance unless you have the US equivalent of an average clause, which is typically called a co-insurance clause. I think certainly as one of the broking houses who's on the phone today knows, they work on some claims, and we do like to use them, but policyholders and brokers really don't like co-insurance clauses when they come through, that's for sure. So, but it is an area that we have to pay attention to. That underinsurance issue is a big issue, though, on the gross profit side as well, because it impacts the rating fundamentally. And if you get the rating wrong, then you're actually insuring a much different business profile than you thought. But I'm not somebody to tell that to a bunch of underwriters listening in. So there you go. Other questions?
We have got a couple there. Just thinking on the interest of time, probably do one more and then we can wrap up. I'll let you pick, Andrew, if you have a preference.
Well, Nick Westercott was the first in. So can you talk briefly about extended periods of liability and gross earnings, please?
Yeah,
again, not one on the UK side, so go.
Yeah, extended periods of liability, extended periods of indemnity. That's one of those features, one of those clauses that helps smooth out the gross earnings form. And we see it, it's pretty typical. We see equivalents, and Andrew spoke to this a little bit on the gross profit side. And, it's just something that sort of, after production is resumed, you get some period of sort of, as a policyholder there, to resume business and sort of match your previous sales. So it's an additional component of BI to help smooth out the lumps. And you can imagine with some businesses that a loss like this could be really lumpy, and it might take a while for, even after you're able to produce again, for you to have adequate cash flow to meet all of your obligations and liabilities, expenses. And of course, you want to make profit again too. So that would be another bolt-on feature that you would have with gross earnings. And it just helps smooth the policyholder's experience out in the event of a loss, rather than the stark, you can turn your machine back on and make widgets, you're no longer indemnified for BI. So, folks, we really enjoyed talking about this. As Joe said, we're going to wrap up now, but we are more than happy to take any questions offline. Send us an email. Don't be shy. And if you want to talk to us more about this in the comfort of your own shops, we're happy to come talk to you that way too. Thanks for having us. Thanks for spending an hour with us. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for speaking. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.